Hi, hello, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Predictable's first ever webinar. We have a couple of speakers today. Phil Sewell, our CEO and co-founder, will be starting, and he will give you an overview of prescriptive analytics and why it's relevant to your business. We will then hear from Colin Crawford, our Director of Data Science, who will demonstrate how this technology is being used today. So a couple of things just before we begin. Firstly, the webinar is going to be 50 minutes long, and just to let everybody know that we are recording this call. Each speaker will talk for around 15 minutes. We will pause after each section to answer any questions that you may have. We are using the Teams Q&A feature, which should be at the top of your screen. We understand that unfortunately this feature only works for some versions of Teams, so if you can't see it, please feel free to email us with any questions and we'll send out your answers after. Secondly, we will be putting out polls throughout. Please feel free to participate and we'll discuss the results with Phil and Colin at the end. The responses to both the poll and the questions are anonymous. So without further ado, I will now introduce you to Phil, who for over 22 years has been leading digital change across retail brands, including Marks & Spencer's, River Island, Arcadia, and Jack Wills. As the co-founder of Predyktable, Phil is now advancing data science to significantly enhance forward decision-making across retail and hospitality. So welcome, Phil. Over to you.
Thank you, Emily, for the lovely introduction, and good afternoon to everybody on the webinar today. So, what exactly is prescriptive analytics? Well, prescriptive analytics is an evolution of data analytics that goes beyond traditional methods. It not only predicts future events with precision, but also provides clear and actionable recommendations on how to achieve profitable outcomes. Now, you may ask the question, and quite rightly so, business forecasting is nothing new. It's standard practice, right? We look at last year's sales and forecast the next. So why do we need new methods today? Well, to answer this question, like many things in life, we often need to examine the past to understand the present and indeed the future. And where better to start than the rise of digital? I worked for companies such as Comet and Marks & Spencer's in the early 2000s. And in those days, there were only 4 ways to shop. You shopped in store, ordered online, ordered by phone, and quite revolutionary at the time, you ordered online and collected in store. Say hello to the first multi-channel initiatives. Fast forward to today, and there are over 12 different ways to shop a brand, from marketplaces such as Amazon and Zalando, through to social selling on platforms such as Instagram and TikTok. Let's take a moment to look at the rise in social. I did some research and found in 2010, there was around 200 million active social media users, primarily driven by Facebook. Fast forward to today, and that number has grown to about 4.6 billion active users. So what does this mean? Well, it means we have a lot more data on consumer behaviors. And according to research carried out by IDC, on average, retailers hold around 1,000% more data on consumer behaviors compared to 2010. So why is this history so important? Well, we all know that data is the only true way to build up a picture of your customers in the digital world. But ask yourself this, are you seeing the full picture? I talked earlier about business forecasting. As we said, we use last year's data, so sales, CRM, promotions, and other financial data, and we project forward. But in this digital age, is this enough? What about changing trends? Let's take Instagram as an example. Instagram has shifted the retail landscape by creating a year-round engagement platform, disrupting traditional seasonal planning, so spring, summer, winter, and autumn. It has forced a more dynamic and agile approach to buying and merchandising. And what about external factors? Well, let's take a couple of recent examples. Interest rates have been put up yet again. Fixed rate mortgages are coming to an end. What impact will this have on the shape of demand for your products and your services? And real-time insights. If a local gig was happening in your catchment area, would you even know it was happening? And if you did know it was happening, would you know the demographics of those attending? How would this impact the types of foods or services you offer to your customers? And last, but definitely not least, no historical reference. I spoke to a number of key industry leaders over the last 6 months and asked them how they went about forecasting sales for this year, given the unprecedented disruption caused by COVID, And this is what they told me. They are using 2017 and 2018 sales data to predict the shape of demand this year. I'll repeat that again. They're using 2017 and 2018 data to forecast this year's sales. How frightening is that? Here are a few further key findings from those industry leaders. But before I reveal those findings, I believe there's a poll which is about to magically appear on your screens. So please feel free to fill this in whilst I am talking. Couldn't get rid of the poll myself then. Right, so 85% of that supply chain optimization, labor and demand forecasting are their top priorities. And this isn't really surprising given the cost of living crisis we're going through at the moment. Most businesses, particularly within retail and hospitality, are feeling the squeeze at the moment. But what was surprising is 65% said that their data analytics tools aren't providing the best value across the business. More than half believe it's because data analytics tools and approaches can't deliver data availability and quality to support confident decision making. And even if they could, 86% confirm they do not have the capabilities to support predictive modeling, primarily driven by skill shortages. And as a business, we understand that skill shortage. Finding good, great data scientists is really hard in this competitive industry. But when pushed, 70% favor predictive capability to cater for their specific business needs. The data is recognized by business leaders as a key enabler to business strategy, and prescriptive analytics can build a fuller picture of what is happening with not only your customers, but the wider consumer market. But so what? The real question is how and where can you practically apply these insights and turn them into commercial value for your organization? So let's examine this question a little closer. I was fascinated by the butterfly effect as a kid, and I still am. It's the geekiness in me. How does a butterfly flapping its wings on one side of the Atlantic cause a tornado on the other side months later? Fundamentally, the butterfly effect is about cause and effect. If we were able to map out every condition, we may see these two events aren't as random as we first thought, but actually are connected by a microcosm of interconnected changes in conditions. This is the premise of prescriptive analytics. So small initial conditions can have a significant and unpredictable impact. Predictive modeling focuses on human behavior and data patterns using historical data, external data, machine learning algorithms, and statistical modeling. And by examining these variables and their relationships, we are able to identify patterns and trends that may affect future events. Now, I'm not suggesting we go out and model predictive impacts of butterflies flapping their wings, although I'd love to do this. But what we can do is show you where and how prescriptive analytics can be deployed in your business. So data is used in every part of your organization. Prescriptive analytics is designed to augment, not replace, productivity and profitability in every aspect of your business. So let's explore some practical applications within your own businesses. We know how expensive digital advertising is as a channel to acquire new customers. This is partly due to the increasing competition and never-ending changes of platform algorithms from the likes of Google. I recently spoke to a client and they told me paid ads in some areas has risen as much as 40% year on year. So what can we do? Well, by analysing the relationships between performance metrics and marketing variables, such as seasonality, external events, and cross-channel multi-touch influences, we can optimize the marketing mix by identifying resource allocations across the channels. We can then recommend budget allocations across all media types, so TV, digital, press, for maximum return on investment. We recently implemented a predictive model to optimize weekly spend across various paid media channels, so digital and TV for a client. This prediction model resulted in a 13% uplift in incremental sales without increasing paid media spend. So let's look at loyalty. We all know retaining a customer is much cheaper than acquiring a new one. In fact, some studies suggest that depending on industry, acquiring a customer can cost up to 5 to 7 times more than retaining existing ones. But knowing when a customer is about to become lapsed and understanding the key triggers requires more than traditional CRM methods. It's about a deeper understanding of your customer base and how it's evolving. How do they feel about ethical trading? How do they feel about sustainability targets? How does your demographic like to be communicated? Is it by social, by emails, or phone calls? And which external events interest them? And therefore, when is the right time and right moment to engage? Research carried out by McKinsey shows that hyper-personalized offers often drives around 10 to 15% increase in revenue. Predictive Analytics takes that heavy lifting out of personalization. So let's talk about that a little bit more. By analyzing historical data alongside factors like weather, social sentiment, and channel preferences, we can model future customer behavior. And by anticipating their needs, we can reduce the lapse risk and target customers who are likely to respond positively to specific marketing campaigns on specific channels. I spoke earlier about the top priorities for businesses this year, with margins being front of mind. Demand forecasting currently involves predicting future demands based on historical data and market trends. But the future is increasingly uncertain. Accurate forecasting can be affected by unforeseen events such as economic downturns, energy prices, wars, and changing consumer behaviours. Analysing all these variables adds complexity to demand forecasting. But by integrating data from various sources, such as historical sales and marketing trends, we can then overlay this data with external factors like seasonality, transport, and customer behaviour to accurately forecast demand. We can then determine the best course of action for your business by training the model with variables such as maximizing profits or minimizing costs, whatever is right for your business. And last but not least, how can prescriptive analytics support the high street? Well, by analysing historical data and historical sales, footfalls, shopping patterns, and purchase behaviours, we can then overlay this with factors such as weather, localised events, and promotion to accurately predict localised demand, leading to optimised inventory and strategic product placement in each store. Furthermore, it allows for optimising staff levels and reducing your payroll costs. A study by Forrester found that retailers who use prescriptive analytics can improve their conversion on an average of 10%. So prescriptive analytics can be deployed in every facet of your organization, from acquiring and retaining customers profitably through to cost optimization, recommendations in your supply chain and staffing levels. It can reduce the risk and guesswork in new product lines or expanding your business into new international territories. But this is advanced technology. So the question we are often asked is, how complex is this to implement? Well, 70% of a prediction model can be built by just using external data. But what does this mean to you? Well, value-add prescriptive models are not designed to be off the shelf. One size does not fit all. Each business is unique and therefore requires a unique model tailored to your business. Rapid customization is achievable because large parts of those models are pre-built using external data. The value of prescriptive modeling is speed to market. The quicker they are implemented, the quicker they learn and adapt, creating even more accurate predictions over time. This is made possible because there's little IT integration required. Your data is exported into a prediction engine and recommendations are then delivered back to you in the format of your choice. Low-hanging fruit is often discovered within weeks of a model going live. You may be surprised how many of these insights can be easily implemented into your organization or operation. And finally, prescriptive modeling follows agile principles. They are designed to add value quickly, delivering return on investments within a year. But like many advancements, the technology, no matter how clever it is only half the equation. The real power is when you combine technology with human expertise. So how does this combination add value? Well, the commercial interpretation of these models is key. Combining in-sector expertise with model recommendations provides a rapid contextual feedback loop, ensuring the value is unlocked and achievable quickly. And throughout this presentation, we've explored the dynamic nature of business today. You need to be able to adapt to market conditions and quickly adjust the model parameters accordingly. And there is a lot of chat, pardon pun, about AI over the last 6 months. And not all AI applications are created equally. Is artificial intelligence right for you and your business? How do you ensure you remain GDPR compliant? How do you keep up to date with the latest regulatory changes? AI experts can help you navigate these questions safely. But despite this caution, AI and ML technology is here to stay. So it's important the wider workforce are taking on a journey to embrace change and fundamentally increase workforce productivity. And like all technology, predictions without actionable actions is just another cool toy. And I think there's been enough cool toys in tech over the past few years. So let's recap on the evolution of data analytics. Most of you are probably using BI tools, which provides historical views of data. We call this descriptive analytics. Predictive analytics is the natural evolution, providing insights on what might happen. Prescriptive analytics provides foresight. It informs you what should you do next based on events that are predicted to happen. And prescriptive analytics as a service takes this one step further and not only informs you what to do, but how this can be actioned and implemented. The final frontier in data analytics. So what are the key takeaways? Well, prescriptive analytics goes beyond traditional analytics by not only predicting what will happen, but also clearly recommending actions to achieve profitable outcomes. It enables companies to make data-driven decisions and take proactive steps to address potential opportunities. However, continuous evaluation and adjustments of prescriptive models are essential to ensure their continuous effectiveness. And so in conclusion, while prescriptive analytics alone may not render your business obsolete, it is the organizations using the power of prescriptive analytics to augment their decision-making processes that will. It is imperative for businesses to embrace data-driven intelligence without delay. Well, thank you, and I hope you found this overview useful and indeed insightful. I believe we have a few minutes for some questions, so over to you, Emily.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, we do, and I really enjoyed the AI pun there. I'm sure the audience did as well and found that very insightful. So we have received a few questions from the audience. If you're happy to answer some, we do have time.
Yeah, that's bring them on.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so the first question that we have here is, what is the difference between econometrics and prescriptive analytics?
Well, that's a good question, a weighty question. Let me think. Well, fundamentally, both econometrics and prescriptive analytics serve similar goals, which is to aid business forecasting. Econometrics primarily focuses on explaining and quantifying the relationships between economic variables such as price elasticity or income effects and market demands, and it uses economic theories as a foundation for its assumptions. But on the other hand, prescriptive analytics is geared more towards accurate predictions. So as I spoke to you through this presentation, so forecasting future events or trends, and by predicting consumer behaviors or sales, inventories, and pricing, and whatever other metrics are out there. And it uses machine learning and modeling, as I mentioned before. And this is what helps retailers make informed decisions and improve operational efficiency. But for me personally, it is the real-time nature of prescriptive analytics, which dynamically adapts to changing market conditions, unlike econometric models, which are often built once a year and depict the long-term forecast. It's a bit of a mouthful there, but that's my opinion.
In summary, yes. Lovely, thank you, Phil. Okay, we just have time for one more as well. So we have another question here from the audience. It's just, so how easy is it to actually adopt prescriptive analytics?
Yeah, we get asked this a lot. I think, well, this is my take. Like everything in life, anything new is difficult, and until someone shows you how, it will remain difficult. So this is why I'm so passionate about prescriptive analytics, and it should be managed as a managed service to guide people through the recommendations and the technology. I think it's important to remember that prescriptive analytics is designed to support your role and not to replace it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And thank you everybody that has submitted questions. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for now before we move on to our next speaker. But if we didn't answer your question, then we will send out all answers after the webinar, so they will be responded to. Okay, so moving on, our next speaker today is Colin, who for over 8 years has been delivering pragmatic modelling solutions to solve problems that improve the way businesses, systems, and people function. Colin leads Predyktable's data science team, who are advancing machine learning and big data technologies to provide commercial value in an ethical and sustainable way. So welcome, Colin. I'll hand over to you now.
Great. Thank you, Emily. And thanks everyone for joining and taking some time out of your day to listen to me. So today I'm going to briefly take you through a demand forecasting use case. As Phil mentioned earlier, demand forecasting is key to almost every business, and a problem that is solved in various ways, but most businesses will attempt to solve it. It helps to optimize product stocking, labor, introduction of new lines, and financial planning, among other things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look specifically at how we can start to use a wealth of data at our disposal to help us forecast demand that little bit better. In turn, this allows us to improve our businesses. Let me click. So let's predict demand. So how would we start doing this? Well, the obvious step is to look at historical behavior. So most businesses will look and they'll say, okay, what did demand look like over the last 4 years? What you would expect to see is some form of peaks and troughs where you had greater demand and less demand. Sometimes for some businesses that might be quite seasonal. So you'll get greater demand perhaps during Christmas or tourism or summer based on tourism. But for other businesses, that might be a bit more uniform. But even within those contexts, there will be peaks and troughs. And what we need to understand is that every peak and every trough on those demand curves is based on a bunch of very complex interactive factors. After all, every Christmas is not the same. Perhaps one Christmas was unseasonably warm and the other one was during an economic downturn. So what we can try and do is explain using data what is causing these effects. This helps us to get a little bit closer to being able to predict what demand might be in the future. So let's break down what historical demand is made up of. So what builds that view? So we know that we want to work with historical demands, and we know that the data itself is driven by a multitude of factors. Let's try and break those down. First, we have local effects. These may affect physical stores, but they'll also affect regions. And so if you're an online retailer, it may affect how people are purchasing you from a regional perspective. So things that we can start looking at is local seasonality. A shop in Blackpool is going to behave very differently than somewhere in Swindon. We can look at things like school holidays as well. There's some really obvious examples of during a hot summer, you may experience more sales of something like garden equipment, or coming up to school holidays, camping or traveling equipment might be sold a bit more. So these sort of effects will have some impact. Then we can look at things like sales and retail events or marketing events. These are going to impact a little bit more on footfall, so might be more related to something like a bricks and mortar store than to your online. We also have things like public strikes, where transportation hubs are shut down and they may affect the amount of people that can come to your store. And you'll have underlying information about regions themselves. So demographics, disposable incomes. You wouldn't expect a town in the home counties to behave in a similar way to somewhere like Northern Ireland or Wales. simply because the demographics are so different, disposable income, and so you would expect that there might be some demand variance between the two. And we've obviously got things like weather and other local events, which I might come on to a bit later. So this is all the sort of local attributes that might impact local demand and regional demand. But let's take a step up. So next we have national, so things that are going on in the UK as a whole. So we've got things like public holidays, and the last few years we had an extra 1 or 2 of those. We've got things like inflation rate and public sentiment. So how are people feeling, and how much income do they believe they have, and how do they feel about making purchases that they may not have felt in a different way? And finally, we've got things like national events. So maybe it's a large sporting event where the whole country gets behind, or maybe there's things like big festivals going on. So again, all of these are going to influence how people behave and how people interact with businesses. And what we try to do is try to say, well, all of those peaks and troughs within your demand curve are going to be impacted by these in some way. Finally, we can look at what's going on in the world around us. So there's some things that are just completely outside of everything going on within the UK. So that's just like days in the week, the seasonality, the seasons of the year, world economics, and then big events in the world like the war in Ukraine or COVID. And again, all of these sort of things impact the way people behave and impact the way people interact with businesses. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to say, given all of this information, we're trying to build a context of what is going on at a given location at a given point in time. What this allows us to do is to say, well, given the context of a day in the past, maybe we see a day in the future that is coming up that has a similar context. Maybe there's certain sporting events going on and the temperature is just right and it's on school holidays. If we can say, well, these 2 days have got quite similar behavior, perhaps the behavior and demand by people on those days is going to be quite similar. This allows us to forecast a little bit better in the future. So what we do at Predyktable is to gather all of this information and we curate it among other data so that we can start thinking about how we expect all of this data to look now, look in the past, but also thinking about how it might look in the future so that we can combine it with client information and we can combine it with real sales information. And that allows us to find that connection and the cause and effect relationship between all of these different data points and the demand themselves. Not only is all of this information useful for forecasting the future, but in doing so, it also allows you to understand the decisions that were made by the business in the past. So we were able to say, you know, during COVID, we've represented COVID in a nice data structure. And what you'll be able to do is you'll be able to say, well, during COVID, you experienced a peak in demand, for example. And what we want to be able to do is we want to separate what was the cause of the actions that you took as a business, be that marketing or sales or offers or things like that, and what was the cause of COVID itself. What this allows you to do is to isolate, you know, this is what marketing does versus this is what COVID does. And so there's a use case in both past behavior, but also leading to making better predictions. So we're trying to build up that contextual information, but it can be a bit tricky sometimes. So if we were talking about an event that we haven't really seen similar events of in the past. So let's talk about, as an example, a Winter World Cup. We haven't had a Winter World Cup before, at least since before I was born. And the idea is that we don't have that data in the past. So we don't have a Winter World Cup in the last 4 years or 5 years of data, or however long you're trying to train and model over. So what we can do is we can say, well, what is a World Cup similar to, and what is the context of a World Cup? And we can start looking at similar events. So we can say, well, we've got the last World Cup, we've got the Euros and the Lionesses and those big sporting events. But we also have things like the rugby and cricket World Cups. We also have big sporting events like the Six Nations and the Ashes. And these aren't all going to be exactly the same. We're very aware of that. But the context of how people interact with businesses, how people go out to the pub and stuff, they may have similar behavior. And what the ML models and the AI models can do is they can learn off of this, especially with something like the Six Nations, which we get every year within the winter time. And so you may get something that you can learn off the Six Nations that we can apply to a Winter World Cup. So we've established how we can start to build up an understanding of demand, especially down to a regional level. But what I want to do today is to go a level lower and focus a bit on bricks and mortar. So let's talk about bricks and mortar. Why? So online demand is probably a bit more advanced. All of the factors that we talked about are still very applicable because you will get differences in regional demand. But it's probably had a little bit more analysis done in it already. Whereas bricks and mortar is probably a little bit, has a little bit more of a larger cost impact because you've got direct labor costs, you've got direct stocking costs. And it's a little bit more interesting. So we can go down to it in a bit of a lower level. But just before I do that, I'm going to pop up the next poll. So you might see that and you can click on it and we can move on. So what can we do with something like a bricks and mortar store? So we can start looking at the spatial data that is associated with a bricks and mortar store. So let's pretend we've got a location and it's, in this instance, is somewhere within London. The first thing that we can start looking at is the number of points of interest or maybe like tourist sites around that location. And so what you can imagine is we've got a bunch of stores in your portfolio, and we've got two stores we're going to look at. One has got 3 points of interest near it, and the other one has got none. And what we want to try and do is we want to say, well, is this information useful? So what we do is we assign all of our different stores with this data, and then the machine learning models can start to say, well, when a bank holiday is on, then a store that is near 3 or more points of interest experiences a different variation in demand than one that doesn't have any points of interest nearby. So you could imagine in the Blackpool and Swindon analogy that I used earlier, that a location in Blackpool would probably experience more demand fluctuations during the school holidays, summer, than the one in Swindon, especially if it is near some tourist locations. Now, one thing to be clear here is that we are not saying that demand will definitely have a higher impact on somewhere that is near places of points of interest. We are allowing these ML models to decide that, to learn that based off of the evidence that they see by giving these ML models the data to do so. So if they see lots of places in the past and lots of different contexts, and they say places that have lots of points of interest nearby experience demand fluctuations in a different way than those that don't. So we can start to build that better picture. So what's the next step? How can we get a little bit smarter? So maybe we can start looking at what we can call an entertainment density. So this is like not only points of interest, but it could be shops, pubs, restaurants, and bars, where people are going to gather, where people are going to go to. So we can say, well, we know that footfall might occur in these areas, and we can say, well, how close are we? How close are our individual stores to these sort of entertainment-rich areas? Because obviously with more footfall, you would expect to see a little bit more demand. But again, we're not telling the model they should see more of a demand. We're just providing that information, and the model can decide that based on the historical demand that it's seen in the context of these locations. So what's the next step? The next step is we can start looking at transportation hubs. This is where people are coming in and out. Obviously, this is probably a lot more applicable to cities and especially somewhere like London. But we can say, again, these areas drive footfall. They drive where people are going to be, at least getting in and getting out. And we can combine these factors. So we can say, well, I've got an entertainment-rich area. I've got an ingress or an egress location, a transportation hub. And I think that people are likely to follow these routes towards one another. And we can say, well, how far are your stores or this store away from these locations? And again, we're not saying that being close to the location means more demand. We're just providing that information to these models, and the models can say, well, in the past, if a store is near one of these locations and there is a big event going on, then these stores experience higher jumps in demand than stores that are not near one of these walking routes. So we're just trying to provide all of this information to these models so that they can start to learn and start to generalize based on this behavior. As I said before, we're never going to be able to forecast perfectly. So we're never going to be able to get every prediction right or capture everything. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to get in the right direction that can start to generate more business value. So we painted a picture of how we can start to predict demand a little bit better and how we can forecast a bit better. But what other advantages do we get from following this? So we can start to learn a little bit about our customer. So not only is all this information useful for predicting demand, but it also helps us understand our customers better. This is particularly easy to understand in the context of events. Different events are going to attract different customers. So there's a vast difference between a big neutral game in a World Cup between France and Brazil versus an England game. You would expect that probably the fans for an England game are going to be a bit more football focused and a little bit more, there might be a bit more drinking culture, whereas fans to a bigger neutral game will be they'll go and watch the match, but they may be less focused on that, and it might be more opportunities for them to do eating out or purchasing before and after that game. Maybe your product specifically appeals to a younger demographics, and there's a football game on involving somewhere like South Korea, which has a very strong national sporting identity, especially with younger individuals. And they, again, would be more prone to use this as a day out to shop as well, rather than to spend the night drinking away. But you can also make some good decisions about it. So maybe as a company like Heineken, you wouldn't want to spend advertising money advertising on a game between alcohol-free states like Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. So the context of the event makes a big difference. Even with the concerts, we can't just say, oh, a concert's on, because there's a very big difference between a Taylor Swift concert and an Iron Maiden concert, especially if you are the owner of H&M or another clothes shop. So building context is really important, and it provides so much rich information, because using this information, we can start to talk to those customers. We can start to engage in them in a very personalized way. So if we know that certain customers are going to go to a certain event or going to be in the area, we can start to engage in them, whether that's through social media or other means. So there's a lot more I could say, but I just wanted to give you a glimpse on how utilizing data of what is going on in the world around us can help us understand the impacts of demand in our business and our customers in a better way. Thank you so much for your time. And I think there's some time for a Q&A. But yeah, thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Colin. And yeah, as a Taylor Swift fan, I can confirm that the queue at H&M was out the door on the same day as the concert. So that's definitely true. So I hope everybody enjoyed that demonstration from Colin, and thank you again for your questions. We have received several questions for you, Colin.
Ooh.
So the first one that we received for you is, how do you ensure the integrity of the data you collect?
It's a good question, so thank you for that. I think you're never ever going to get anything perfect, but there's a lot of things that you can do to mitigate and to protect yourself. So I think selective in where you're sourcing that data from, being sure that it is a secure location, it's from a respected place. Building out a lot of verification and validation. So when you get that data in, understanding what the data is, validating that it makes sense from a quantitative point of view, but also from just a domain understanding. Were England playing that day, or does that temperature look reasonable for the UK, etc. I think once you start to understand the data itself, you can start to build out appropriate monitoring and alerting, which includes things like constraints and boundaries. So that means, like, I've got data in the past and now I've got a live feed coming in. I can say, well, if the weather in the UK goes above 40 degrees, create some alerts, because that could be a data issue rather than what's actually happening. And so starting to build out that sort of infrastructure and the automation that allows you to say, well, this data coming in does it does follow the same behavior as the data that we've seen in the past. And I think another big part of what we would do specifically is like treating our models as living models. So rather than building a model, deploying it, and then sort of like forgetting about it, we would want to go on that journey with that model. So validating outputs of it, retraining it on quite a regular basis, but also just analyzing what's going in and what's going out. I don't think there's any like one set rule that can sort of solve this problem, but I think there's a lot of steps you can take that allow you to mitigate against any of the larger risks to it. Yeah, so I think there's probably lots of other things that other people could include, but that is probably just a sample of some of them.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very topical question right now. Data's all over the news with AI, so brilliant question. Thank you very much, Colin. So I have a few other questions. We do have time if you're happy to answer some for us. So the next one that we have for you, yeah, brilliant. So we've received one. It's how do you make a prediction for an event that has not yet happened? And they've put e.g. COVID.
That's another, yeah, that's a good question. And I think the short answer is that you can't predict an event like COVID, and you can't predict an event like the war in Ukraine. But I think the approach you need to really take is you need to build a representation of those sort of events that you can look at the impact of historical behavior for. So you can say, when I think I alluded to some of it a little bit earlier, but when COVID was happening, we can start to separate out, well, what was the cause of COVID and what might have been the cause for the actions that you took as a business. And so these large events, you can't say that when they're going to come or what's going to happen, but you can at least look in the past and you can start to separate out, we had a terrible year, but it was because of COVID, not because of our business fundamentals. And so that adds a lot of value. And I think the underlying assumption going forward is that, we assume that COVID isn't going to happen every year. And so you build your forecasting, you build your predictions, you build your plan around business as usual rather than the sort of something like COVID. I mean, I'm sure there's some statistical methods for doing once in a lifetime events and stuff like that, but I don't think that is going to add a lot of value on a day-to-day business and the decisions that we're trying to influence and change. So yeah, I think in summary, you can't really predict it going forward, but what you can do is you can separate out the cause and effect in the past, as well as you can try and do the best you can, and that will allow you to understand the decisions that you've made and how they've impacted it, and allow you to forecast better in the future.
Yeah, that's really clear. Thank you so much. Thank you. So before we come to the end, we just want to discuss the results from the polls that we've put out. The polls are still live in the chats. If anybody wants to submit a late answer now, I'll just give you all a minute. Okay, perfect. So Phil and Colin, the first poll that we published today was, what do you believe to be the biggest challenge for businesses? And the answer that had the most responses so far is accurately forecasting demand. Do either of you want to comment on that?
I'll take this, Colin, should I?
Go for it. Might add something, but
I think every business is feeling the pinch, and these priorities, I think, reflect that. I think the sentiment from this poll reflects the wider mood in industry. I think all businesses are looking for ways to reduce costs where they can. So yeah, demand forecasting is very topical at the moment, but also you can see from the polls, marketing campaigns and retention is there as well. I think for me, upon reflection, businesses tend to be moving away, right now, on big blue sky ideas, and it's important. And these are important. Big blue sky ideas are important, but right now it's about getting through the next month and the next quarter.
I think from a modeling perspective, also to add is that demand forecasting is kind of like an underlying model that is used for so many different things. So if you are trying to optimize your marketing spend or something, you generally want to have demand forecasting baked in there somewhere. So there's a lot of I think it's it's a critical problem, but I think it's also an underlying problem that reaches so many elements of the business that it's not surprising that that's the one that stands out.
Yeah, thank you. And obviously it's not something that you can just summarize. There's many challenges right now in business. So thank you both for your thoughts on that. Okay, and then the second poll that was put out throughout the webinar was, what do you perceive to be the biggest challenge to implementing predictive analytics? So there's a clear winner here with 5 responses. It was integration with existing systems and processes. Who's you want to take that?
I think that integration is always going to be a bit tricky because you've got a lot of different systems that are communicating with one another. I think that we're getting to a stage in technology and cloud-based technology that integration is becoming a lot more standardized, and I think it's more of a fear rather than necessarily how practically difficult it is. I think it's if you get a bunch of engineers down into a room, those problems get solved fairly quickly, and it's generally all the hubbub around it. I think there is some stuff to do with, like, people are very like, I work in AWS or I work in GCP, and there's some elements of, you know, I feel comfortable in my realm, in my area. But I think from a technical perspective, I think that integration, especially if it's in an API-driven way, should be something that can be worked through. And I think one of the things that we are really strong on and we're really focused upon is being very agile about that. And so being able to integrate with whatever system a client would believe is most suitable for them, whether that's into the shopping pipeline or into BI tools, rather than saying this is how you interact with us. It's sort of like, well, how do you want us to interact with you? Because different people and different companies will get value in very different ways.
I'd also add, we're also just dealing with data. So, I mean, many of us have been involved in big, you know, IT integrations where actually there's legacy systems, huge integration, problems. But, you know, from a data perspective, all we need is your internal data. And, you know, once that's exported, you know, the work's just done in the engine, and then those results are delivered back in a format that, you know, is right for you. So it's, yeah, from my perspective and what I've seen on IT project, it's quite a light integration piece of work.
Yeah, great comments, thank you. So we have 2 minutes left of the webinar. So Phil, I'm just going to put you on the spot and go back to a previous question that was asked for you. Okay. It's a very fair question. They've just said, how do I gain confidence that it will work? I'm assuming that it is prescriptive analytics of a service. If you could just answer that one for us, please.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think you need to implement a low-cost, low-risk trials. And, you know, this trial could be on a portion of your stores or your shops or certain categories. But the key thing is fundamentally this technology's data. So the good news is that the results are easily measured and you'll know very quickly if it's working or not. So trial it, yeah, low-cost trial, see the results for yourself. And hopefully you'll see the uplift and the benefits pretty much immediately.
And just to add, those metrics are really key. So the definition of success and how you measure that data, I think, is what really makes or breaks, you know, has this worked? Is this valuable? And so just spending the appropriate amount of time and thought going into how do I evaluate this and how do I quantify whether this is successful or not is worth the work. It's worth the resource.
Yeah.
Brilliant. And as Phil just mentioned as well, as you can see on the screen, everyone that's attended the webinar today can request a free product demonstration from us. And so that brings us to the end. So on behalf of the whole team at Predyktable, thank you very much, everybody, for joining our webinar today. And thank you for participating. We greatly appreciate it. We hope that you found today educative and you now have a better understanding of prescriptive analytics and how you can apply it to your own company. If you want to contact anyone from the team, you can see our contact info on the screen or we'll to the webinar. We will also send out all of the questions that you've submitted with the answers, so don't feel like we've missed anybody out. And many thanks again to Phil and Colin. That was a great session, and we really hope everyone has a great day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Bye-bye.
Cheers.